This is The Balance Dilemma. We tackle the often uniquely, but not always, female dilemma, managing life, work, family, and self. I'm Maura, Carlin.
And I'm Christie, Derrico. At The Balance Dilemma, we speak with women and men to hear their balanced stories. Our guests are entrepreneurs, reinventors, creators, executives, parents, and partners, telling us what we really want to know. How the heck did they manage that? And can you have it all and all at the same time?
What's your personal brand? Not what you buy or prefer, but you yourself. And does how you spend your time align with that brand and your values? Our guest today not only talks the talk, but walks that walk for herself and others. And she's going to explain how to put it all in action. Janna Meyrowitz Turner is president of Synastry Capital, described as a cross-sector impact vehicle, helping individuals and businesses make an impact and grow with intention. Entrepreneurial at heart, Janna's a dedicated advisor and angel investor in over 20 portfolio companies, focusing primarily on communities with historically restricted access to capital, like female, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and she's a founder of VCs for Repro, investors supporting reproductive rights. Of course, there's more, and it's all going to be in our show notes, but we really do want to get to talking to Janna. So welcome to The Balance Dilemma, Janna.
Welcome, Janna.
Thanks. I'm honored to be here.
Janna, we'd like to start with your background and the influence of your parents, because there's a story there, and so much of that story you include in your links. What can you tell us about that? Your mom was a sociologist and your father was a media theorist. What does that mean, and how did it influence you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that. So yes, both of my parents are academics, PhDs. My mother's dissertation in the 1990s was a survey of Parents Magazine from 1970s through the 90s and how the roles of fathers were portrayed. So her PhD is in family sociology. My father had a book that came out in 1985 called No Sense of Place, about the impact of electronic media on social behavior. So these types of things were dinner table conversations at my house, and I'm very grateful for the media literacy, the cultural awareness of understanding why we feel the way we feel about things, why we do the things we do, and what are the forces, external and internal, that inform the way we do the way we live our lives, essentially.
How did that influence your education and career, though? You majored in journalism?
Exactly. So I went to a liberal arts school, Brandeis University, outside of Boston, the Boston area. And I studied American Studies and journalism was what I focused on. I've always really enjoyed history. Every time I end up helping my son with something related to history, I remember how much I love history. And really, Brandeis, my parents taught me how to think critically, and Brandeis taught me how to put that into action in context with my peers. And I think, I say that I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. Even at Brandeis, I did quote unquote entrepreneurial things in terms of gathering people around everything from before we went on spring break, there was this really great bikini waxer that I went to that was near our school, and I had gotten all my friends to go, right? So in theory, she was my first PR client. I got all my friends to go to her, and then when she moved to another place, before we went on spring break, I had her come to school, and she basically set up a pop-up waxing studio in my dorm room. And so this idea of bringing people together around making our lives easier, especially in things that are uniquely women's issues, I think has always been important to me, because I go back to these dinner table conversations and really learning that our power in society is how we consume and how we shop and the things that we buy. As you said, Maura, yes, we buy things that are brands, but also in our society, so much of that reflects who we are and how we present ourselves to the world and how we deploy our very, very valuable assets, which include our time, includes our money, and includes what I call relationship capital. And that goes back to really thinking holistically about the value that we bring to society in terms of the balance dilemma, right? Life, work, family, self, all of those require various forms of resources. And so when I talk about personal brand alignment and I talk about this lens that I've been so lucky to have on the world since a young age, I'm looking really holistically at all the different resources that we can use to flex our power and leadership in the world.
So sitting around that family table with your parents, what was talked about money and finances? Two college professors, that's not exactly focused on money, right?
Right. So I would say that I didn't necessarily get financial lessons around the kitchen table. I think a lot of us, growing up are figuring out our own money stories and what that means to us. I would say that more so finances and money were put in context for me in terms of one of my father's courses at University of New Hampshire, Intro to Mass Communication, and he put together kind of a course booklet called Power Pleasure Patterns. And so when I talk about media literacy and understanding, I can look at a segment on the news and I look about that. I'm like, okay, well, who owns the news station? Who owns the media company? How does the money and power flow in this situation? And I think that is more of the context putting that I'm so grateful to have gotten from around that dinner table.
So this brings us to a really interesting question. You were a young entrepreneur. At 23, you started a company called Style House. Now, was that a side hustle or was that a full-time gig?
Great question. So when I first started Style House, it was my company, my full-time gig. That being said, my first client had been my employer before that. So essentially, I worked at a small public relations firm here in New York City. We had a small handful of clients, and there were only 3 of us at the firm. And my boss at the time she had been running her firm for 2 decades at that point. And she was basically like, here are the clients, like, do PR. And so I got to do a lot of on-the-job training and kind of figuring out how to, here's a brand, here's a fashion company, and how do we get their message out there? And yes, my boss at the time taught me many things about media relations and how to communicate with media. I also had the autonomy then to be able to explore all these new forms of social media and blogging and other things in the mid-2000s that I saw very much were going to democratize the way that we got information and also, of course, the way that we shop.
Well, your entry point, speaking to the mid-2000s, you came into this at the perfect time that age and technology. I was just listening to something on Tarte Cosmetics, and she said they've never taken out an ad because you started with MySpace, then it went to Facebook, and it sounds like you came into this at the perfect opportunity for a 23-year-old. What was it like to run your own business, though? Were there any challenges? You came from a background with 2 parents who are professors, and now you're going into entrepreneurialism. Tell us how you handled that.
Totally. Well, my naivete was one of the best things because I didn't know all the things that I would be stepping into. I just knew for sure that I really enjoyed working with clients, working with brands directly, telling their stories, and doing that in expansive ways. And so my naivete of being like, well, let me try this for myself, gave me a lot, including the fact that I graduated Brandeis with no student debt. There's a lot of privilege that's wrapped up in that. What I will also say is that it was really clear to me, having worked at different agencies, that when I looked at the clients that I was able to produce incredible results for, it was when I genuinely liked and used the product, right? When I was a consumer.
Starting with the waxing.
Starting with waxing, exactly. Starting with waxing. And I think this is also, part of my privilege was like, well, I want to combine what I'm really good at and what is also fun and interesting to me, right? I for some reason, at age 23, thought that I deserved that. I guess that's the millennial. So elder millennial in me.
How did you get information on how to run a business? Did you read books, go to blogs, or was it just from observing the PR company you were working at?
A lot of it was observing the PR company that I was working at. Public relations agencies there's not a lot of overhead, right? If you don't have an office, you really just need forms of communication. Like we were calling journalists, we were emailing journalists, we were having meetings with journalists. And I also, when I was at the small firm, I was billing our clients. I was doing our monthly billing of the retainers for our clients. So I at least knew the mechanics of how that worked, right? And I knew, okay, we need a retainer agreement, 3 months, 6 months, a year. What's the monthly fee that we feel good about? And in the beginning, I charged very low monthly fees because I wanted to build a great portfolio of clients and business. Bringing it all together, right, it had to align with my personal brand. I was building a brand. I've been building a brand since I'm 23. These are the things that I want to talk about.
Janna, you're listening to The Balanced Dilemma. We're speaking with Janna Meyrowitz Turner.
Janna, branding, this whole concept. I'm a lawyer. To me, just having an occupation in that profession, that was my brand. I have come to learn that if you're going to have an identity in the business world these days, you need to have a brand. What does that mean, and how do we get it? Tell us about that.
I think the most basic way to think about a brand and your personal brand is, what do people think of when they think of you? How do people feel when they're around you? What do people think of you for? If someone says, do you know anyone who fill in the blank? Oh, yeah, my friend so-and-so. And you're right. For many of us who have degrees, a doctor, a lawyer, our identities become incredibly wrapped up in that. And I think the difference between a brand and an identity, that's what I talk about in terms of personal brand alignment. You have a brand. You are who you are. Your brand is an amalgamation of all the things that you've done and all the things that you are and all of your experiences, good, bad, and seemingly innocuous.
It's hard, though, for a lot of people to think of themselves as a brand. We're people. And you may not want everything in your life out there, it's just hard to think of yourself as a packaged product. Maybe you could try convincing us why everyone should do that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that a personal brand is not about self-promotion. And it's not about spilling your life to the internet and telling everyone your deepest, darkest secrets. It is about leveraging all the things that make you to have a more impactful, enriching, fulfilling, powerful life.
Interesting.
And this show is called The Balanced Dilemma. And that is very real because when your personal brand is misaligned, you are out of balance, right? You are some cues that I tell clients, or that clients will come to me and I'll be like, ooh, we're misaligned. Sometimes you're not doing your best work. You're not doing work that you're proud of. Some people are like, I'm being petty at the office. Why am I being that way? Okay, you're misaligned.
So what do you mean by misaligned? We all do things that we don't necessarily want to do, but we need to do, but wouldn't necessarily call that a misalignment.
Right. Well, the idea is that the way that you do something, it's the balance. The dilemma that we're talking about is, how do you balance being true to yourself and being true to the world? How do you balance your expectations of yourself and other people's expectations of you?
This brings up an interesting point. So both Maura and I have gone on this journey and have had to learn about branding. And we talked about being identified in a profession or a career. There's also being branded as a mother, and that can eclipse all other attributes in our lives. So the branding journey that Maura and I have both gone on, separate and apart, and Maura worked with you in this process, and I've worked with someone. There was a soul-searching component that was quite interesting. You had to fill out a questionnaire. You had to ask difficult questions. You had to address things that you were uncomfortable with. It seems that there is some psychology in this branding. It doesn't mean that, like you said, getting out on the internet and exposing yourself per se, but it means finding that je ne sais quoi, that thing about you.
The core thing
that needs to be part of your sales pitch, and you need to be true to it. Is that how branding works?
Exactly. And we don't know, anyone who's trying to help someone do this for themselves, we can't know what we don't know. right? And what the other element of that too that's challenging is that many of the things that are very unique, valuable, uniquely ours assets that we bring to anything that we're doing, those tend to also be the things that the world, society, systems in general try to convince us are liabilities.
So give us some examples of that.
Give us an example.
Well, I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the whole aging problem. And in fact, it was just the other day I saw something on LinkedIn where literally they were pitching advice on how boomers and Gen Xers can revamp their resumes to hide their age to get job interviews. Thoughts?
Right, and I think that's ridiculous. Why would you hide your age? Like, why would you want to downplay and minimize all of the experience and wisdom that you have? Okay, well, the other side of that question is because sometimes it's intimidating to hiring managers, right? So that's where we're talking about the balance between what we know for sure, which is that, I am a wealth of information and I'm more valuable to that company than that, 20-whatever-year-old, whether they realize it or not. But then there is a very real situation that racism exists and ageism exists and, sexism exists. And so this goes back to that there's no right or wrong answer. You're always going to be too much or not enough for somebody. You're going to be too old or too young. I've dealt with that in my career, all different kinds of ageism on both sides, and I'm not even 40 yet. And so that's why I say that your personal brand is it's about being more you on purpose, because that is what you will have for the rest of your life, and it's authentic, right? This is the word that gets floated around a lot, authentic. And how do you define authentic? It's kind of like you know it when you see it. It's also fleeting. And so that's when people are like, oh, personal brand, and it like makes them want to vomit. I think it's actually really liberating to learn that it's not about self-promotion, but it's about leveraging all these things that you already have to maximize your impact and your opportunities for the long haul, right? For the long haul, you're an ever-changing person in an ever-changing world. And so I often use the analogy of a tree, that you want to have, strong roots, because the world is going to wind and rain and storm around us, especially in the 21st century.
Yes.
So the more rooted we can be in who we are and use that as our direction, we're going to get a lot farther and really future-proof our happiness and our fulfillment.
On the branding, do you take clients where you don't believe in the product? Like, people don't always have the ability to turn down work just because they're not committed to it. So I'm wondering how you deal with that.
Yeah, well, this was one of the challenges for me when I was running my agency, especially when my agency got large and we had a really great reputation. There was this conundrum, a balanced dilemma, if you will, where the folks that could afford our retainers and wanted to work with us less and less became the people that we really wanted to open up our Rolodex and our brains for, in terms of how they were leading in this moment in society and culture. And at the same time, I've definitely worked on companies where I was not the target audience, which is different than me.
Right, that's totally different.
But I would say for me, it always had to be part of a broader movement of how we are changing the way people behave in the world. And those were the filters for me in terms of when I was running Style House PR and we were working with brands. Okay. Now, today, the majority of the brand work that I do is in companies where I am a shareholder, an advisor, or an investor.
And Janna, hold that thought. We're going to come back to that in a moment. We're going to take a break.
Okay.
This is The Balanced Dilemma. We're talking with Janna Meyrowitz Turner. Janna, when we broke off, we were discussing wanting to work with to make an impact, and you started a new business, Synastry Capital, as a offshoot of Style House, your first company. And you describe it as a cross-sector impact vehicle. What is that, and what was the purpose?
Yeah, thank you. So from a personal standpoint, from my personal brand alignment standpoint, I realized that that there were some misalignments with the chapter. I had built my first business, Style House PR, and I realized that over time it was limiting me, and it was limiting the capacity of how I could make my impact in the world, the work that I could do, even in
what
some
way?
of my earning potential. So what I say now is that I went from running an agency to having agency. But in 2016, I had 7 people that were working for me. I think we were doing a fairly good amount of business, and I was a mother, and I had a child who was 2 years old at the time. And I would say that I hit a bit of my ambition collision, if you will, where I realized that I couldn't mentor and develop talent in the ways that I had enjoyed doing for the last 10 years of running Style House. I couldn't do that while also doing the work I wanted to do and also being the person that I wanted to be.
So what did you do?
That I talk about with personal brand alignment, I'm now able to say I realigned my personal brand. I recalibrated what I was doing.
Was there a particular point or a particular thing that hit you and made you go, I got to fix this?
The 2016 election.
Okay. Okay, it made you want to get involved in things outside business.
There were a lot of women in my life who were asking for personal brand alignment, even though they didn't have the words and I wasn't officially offering it yet.
Okay. But I never heard this term, ambition collision, and I think maybe it's one we need to know.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, it just, I realized that I couldn't, overwork myself to equality and happiness, right? I think we as a society talk about the things that we can control, the things that we can't, the systems that we are within, and how we want to change systems. But it was impossible for me to keep my house and my home in the way that I wanted it to be. Not just wanted it to be, needed it to be for my sanity, right? I will say that the women that worked for me that were bright and interesting and driven, I had no bandwidth to caregive for them in the way that I had in my early 20s when I, was now a mom. And, it's the example of like, by the time we get to our desks at 9 a.m., I've had a whole other life. And they're like, kind of crawling out of bed with their coffee. Maybe they got to work out in the morning, which I used to do before I became a parent.
So is this a matter of you needed to cut hours to...
I needed to recalibrate because I didn't have enough time to do the work I wanted to do, right? I was so busy kind of in the business. Like I was almost like I had a job. I wasn't running a business, if that makes sense. I was like, I wasn't able to grow and develop and evolve the business the way that I wanted to and needed it for my life with all of those things in place. So I will say one of the biggest things was that I changed the way that I did business so I didn't need to have such a large team. I had been managing people since I was 23, and I was fairly good at it. Like, I wouldn't say I was an incredible manager. I was always much more of a kind of spiritual leader and inspirational, motivational leader. Like, here's what we're going to do. And just like I'm very self-taught in public relations, I helped a lot of the women that worked for me think outside of the box of the things that they learned in their marketing programs in college and other things like that. But the other big issue on a broader level, and this is a gender issue as well, is that I was undervaluing what we were doing, right? We were a public relations firm. We were doing strategic communications and business development, but I was doing quote unquote strategic partnerships that I should have been calling mergers and acquisitions.
Okay. Wait. Go back. That's lingo. Let's,
Yes, I was doing strategic partnerships I should have been calling mergers and acquisitions. I was making very thoughtful, intentional introductions and giving great ideas to my clients and other businesses to work together, and I realized that those were turning into $1 million deals that I had nothing to do with.
So you were looking to capitalize on this side effect, this, this other offshoot of what you had brought about. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. We were providing so much value for our clients in ways that we weren't owning and harnessing because we weren't talking about all that. And I think this is something that happens especially for women, right? It's like,
absolutely,
we're good at lots of things. And I I enjoy, redoing the copy in your catalog. It's fun for me. Don't worry about it.
Exactly.
Right.
And they don't get, it's not monetized. So what did you realize this thing that was occurring? What did you do about it? And tell us how it inspired this new business venture and how did you monetize it?
Yeah. So, I will say in 2016, I rebranded Style House first and foremost. We cut PR off the end of Style House PR, and we were just Style House because public relations meant so many different things to different people, and I needed to own that. I needed to own the definition of what we did instead of lamenting that other people didn't get it, right? And this goes back to, like, personal brand. Any brand in general, brand is, you want to be understood. You want people to understand you and value what makes you valuable. Otherwise, it's misaligned.
So now, after 2016, we're at Synastry Capital.
Yeah.
Tell us what that is.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Synastry Capital has 3 arms. It's a cross-sector impact vehicle designed to change the ways that money and power flow in the world.
Right. You're going to have to tell us what all of that means.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Change the way money and power flow in the world. That is a really impactful sentence. How do you do that?
Yeah, so it goes back to some of the things I was talking about in the beginning around, like, our power as women in society is how we shop and consume. It's very wrapped up in our personal brands and our identities. And so I spent the first part of my career helping women be more conscious consumers and helping the brands that we were working with more empathically engage with women and understand and recognize our power. The second part of my career I describe as helping business leaders be more conscious citizens. And what that looks like in Synastry Capital as a cross-sector impact vehicle, there's 3 arms. There is the portfolio of companies that I started advising and investing in when I was running Style House PR. I now technically call that Style House Ventures. So Style House PR does not operate as a PR firm anymore. It operates as a holding company for my angel investment. So I advise startup founders, as you mentioned, that are majority from underrepresented groups. They're often overlooked by other forms of capital, or because 93% of check writers in venture capital are white men, so they may not understand the intricacy of these issues. They may not even think that these are businesses.
Absolutely.
Let alone that there are enormous audiences for them. So part of it is helping to build, advise, and grow brands, startups that I believe in that I think will change the future. The other piece of it is Synastry, the consultancy, my personal brand alignment practice, through which I work with high impact individuals, executives, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, doctors, to help them be better understood by a broad range of stakeholders. And, all these things that we're talking about around how you deploy your valuable assets personally, your time, your money, your relationships. So I work one-on-one with people through that, but I also end up working with institutions and organizations, but it's always through the lens of leadership, because ultimately a brand or what a business does, those are individual decisions that are made by people, groups of people, but individual people in a room, real people, real humans.
And number 3?
And number 3 is my activating arm. And that is where VC's for Repro sits. But I call these my conscious capitalism projects. And this is really kind of the X factor when it comes to changing the ways that money and power flow in the world. And that is through cross-sector partnerships. Because when we get the private sector to talk about things in the public sector and how that impacts people in the social sector, that is how we create real change.
On that, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and continue this discussion.
This is so interesting.
You're listening to The Balanced Dilemma. And before we get back to our guest, Christie, would you tell our listeners where to find us?
Sure, Maura. The Balanced Dilemma can be found at thebalanceddilemma.com, where you can listen to old episodes and sign up for our newsletter, find show announcements, show notes, resources, and further reading. Follow us on social media at The Balanced Dilemma Podcast on Facebook and LinkedIn. Podcast episodes are also available for listening while you take a walk or you're driving on Apple iTunes, Google, Spotify. Please rate us and share us with your friends. Get the word out. Back to our guest.
So we were talking about the consultancy. Can you give us some examples of the work that you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So some of my clients are the highest ranking women and people of color in corporate America. Others are multi-hyphenates who have books and varieties of interests that I help them weave together into a tapestry to make it all make sense and give them the words to do that. For corporate clients, it's interesting because it's just how we opened this conversation about finding that balance of being you within another system, and how much do you conform to the system, and how much do you bring your uniqueness to the system.
And that's a problem that CEOs have a lot. Do I bring my values, what I believe in? I was just reading something, questions whether a CEO should post their personal views or not. Is that the kind of guidance you give?
Well, there's no right or wrong answer. It has to be aligned with that person's, with both the brand of the person and the brand and mission of the organization. And it is the synastry, if you will, thereof, between those things, which are very nuanced, and words matter, the words that we choose to use when we are talking about sociocultural leadership things in the 21st century. And there are people who think that it's private information how a CEO feels about something, and there are people that think that if your business is part of the market and the ecosystem and the economy that we all participate in, then the lens through which you use to make decisions actually is other people's business.
So let's take this away from the CEOs for a minute and talk about most workers and this thought of bringing your No. So tell us, what do you mean by that, bringing your authentic self?
So it doesn't mean sharing everything that's going on in your life. But what it might mean is that if you're having a particularly challenging parenting day, that you just say, I'm having a particularly challenging parenting day, right? You don't need to say what's going on. It's not anyone else's business, but you can choose to put yourself in context, as I say, and to be human. And the other part of that is really important, and I have learned this from working with so many powerful and influential people, is that everybody underestimates their power and their influence. So middle management Maggie might not feel like she can show up and say, I'm having a particularly challenging parenting day, because maybe upper management doesn't give it. But for middle management Maggie, for the women that are working under her, for her to say, or not even just the women, for any of the parents or any caregivers that work under her, to be able to say, I'm having a really challenging parenting day today, that to me is leadership in action, right?
Don't you think it might be harder for men to do that? How they might be received if they came in and said, I'm having a really challenging parenting day?
Well, we've discussed that. It depends on the context. Sometimes they get kudos for that, and we do not. But what do you say, Janna?
There's no right or wrong answer. It's subjective. It's based on the context. It's based on who's there, and also why you're doing it, right? Like, if the idea is to create a safe space for other people in your company to be human, then you should be doing that, because that is how the best companies perform. And this also goes back to like where you focus on company performance and where you focus on your own performance or needs, and the unique equation, dilemma, if you will, that we do there. But I think as we're talking about this, when I talk about personal brand power is mastering that balance. And we're going to have times where we over-index in wrong directions. We're going to have times where we make decisions on behalf of the company that maybe we're not proud of as people, and we're going to have moments where we make decisions as people that that we hope the company will forgive. But in most cases, the goal, what we are striving for, should not be more power, more money, more people reporting to us. Ooh. What we should be aiming for is more of that balance, more of being in that strong place in the middle where we are focused on who we are as people and putting that in context with the world.
But if I hear you saying what I hear you saying, it's intentionality, because it's not having a meltdown online or with your, colleagues. It's more intentionally employing a statement that says, you know what, today I have a personal situation that I need to take care of, and owning that. But just falling apart in front of everyone may not be a strategic use. And this is something that you're saying you should be aware of, and you should be employing regardless of what level you are in the structure. And
the company should accommodate that in a sense.
Well, let's also remember that meltdowns look and feel very differently. I mean, some people could argue that men have been melting down in the workplace for decades.
You were talking about the screaming or the throwing thing.
Yeah.
But this brings up
the emotional responses that we have as human beings.
This brings up a really good question. Tell us about how you juggle family with your partner, and how does that work? One question we usually that's part of our repertoire is can a couple have two equal careers at the same time? How does it work in your dynamic?
Yeah, it's challenging. My husband has been an executive in corporate for most of his career in advertising, sales, and media. And I have been an entrepreneur for all of my career. So I think that we are very lucky in that, especially in the earlier days of, like, even before the pandemic, right? I didn't realize when I started my company at 23 that I'd be building in this flexibility for myself. I mean, some entrepreneurs laugh. They're like, you start a company to think you're going to have flexibility, and you don't.
But a lot of people do think that. But right. How did that work for you?
So I'm very intentional about my time, and that includes, you asked at the end of the last segment, like, how do you do all these things, right? And so time is our most valuable resource. It is non-renewable, doesn't scale. It gets spent whether you decide how to spend it or not. And so when I hit my ambition collision, as we discussed, there was a period where I literally wrote down, memorialized everything that I want and need to do. And I was like, what could it look like in a world where all these things happen, or some degree of all of these things happen? And that's an ever-evolving thing, right? The reason that personal brand alignment, branding feels very permanent, right? To brand something.
Right.
Personal brand alignment goes back to that you're an ever-evolving person in an ever-changing world. And so anyone who's a parent knows that right when you think you've, like, mastered that age, something new comes along. And so that, I think, time alignment, being able to go back to that and being like, am I spending enough time with my family? Am I able to do the things that I want to do? My husband and I had spreadsheets for all the things that we do around the house, even before my friend Eve Brodsky came to market with Fair Play. And now we've adopted a lot of the Fair Play language and systems, but we've also adapted it for ourselves. We've customized it to work for us and what we need, both at this juncture in our lives and at the juncture in our son's life. He's 8 now. He's in 3rd grade.
Are there any responsibilities that you've allocated that you think we might find an unusual allocation?
Sure. I mean, I was on a phone the other day with an economist, a healthcare economist, and I said something somewhat innocuously that he thought was hilarious. I said that, my husband holds the laundry card because I hold the civic engagement card.
There you go.
So did yours owning the business and the quote-unquote flexibility, whether it was real or not, help you in your parenting, or was it something that you both had static obligations and it wasn't, so much of an issue?
It's challenging because there was a period in the beginning where I felt like I was just failing at everything, right? I wasn't the person that I wanted to be at the office. I wasn't the person I wanted to be at home, and there was nothing in between. And I will say that one of my big kind of seismic shift was when I built something for myself called Magic Mondays. And Magic Mondays, this is when I still had a team, and I had an office that we worked out of. And on Magic Mondays, I was not at home where I could get distracted by all my stuff at home. I was not at the office where I could get distracted by office staff where people were asking me questions. I didn't have any calls or meetings. I was by myself, and sometimes I worked from a random WeWork, sometimes I worked from a Le Pen quotidienne, but it was my day that allowed me to feel like I could catch up on homework, as I call it, like stuff I needed to do for the home, whether it's, bills or logistics or whatever, stuff related to our son's caregiving, stuff related to my own health, and then also have some clarity on the leadership that I wanted in my business, how I wanted to be running my business, because it was, when I look back at it now, I was like, I got to carve out time to think. I don't have time to think, and I need time to think. And so, I wrote a piece
Janna,
about this, the biggest. Yeah.
I would love to see that piece. You need to send it to us so we can put it in our show notes, because Magic Monday, I'm all into that. Idea. But I'm going to ask you a question we ask all of our guests, and this is the cincher. Get yourself ready. Can you have it all and all at the same time?
No.
Yeah. Well, not the answer some people want to hear, is it?
No, well, we're taking a survey. Some people have said yes. Many people have said no. Some people say you can have it all, but not exactly at the same time. So it really depends on the perspective.
I think defining all and defining what success looks like on your own terms is, right, I think, why I say no. Because success and having it all, generally, what comes to mind is other people's definitions of success.
Thank you so much, Janna. It has been a wonderful talking with you.
Well said. Pleasure. This is Christie Derrico.
And I'm Maura Carlin.
Thank you for joining us on The Balanced Dilemma.
All the information about Janna will be in our show notes.